Hello and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 9, Section 1. This is going to be about George Washington's presidency and some of the things that he does during the first years of his presidency. The Continental Congress elected George Washington as the nation's first president. The book says that Washington accepts this honor and the burden of this new office, and you kind of need to understand what that means. And what he's really talking about is that he knows that what he does in his first years as president would guide how future presidents carry out their responsibilities. So basically he is shaping the office of president, and that's a huge responsibility. That's a huge burden. And that's basically what he's talking about. Washington was inaugurated, which means that he is formally sworn in as president on April 30th, 1789 in New York City. As the first president, Washington knew, like I said, that his actions would set a precedent, which is an example that becomes a standard practice. Many political ideas and traditions were established under George Washington's watch, and that is what we're going to look at in this one. Some of those things that he does that future presidents continue to do, even to this day. One example is the president's title and what we call the president. Some people wanted to call him His Excellency, but others thought it made him sound too much like a king. So they decided on calling him Mr. President, and this was a title that Washington agreed with himself. And because they called George Washington that, we still call the president that today. The Constitution establishes a Supreme Court, but under George Washington, they have to figure out, how they're going to set up the details of the Supreme Court. So under George Washington, the Congress passes the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. And this is going to kind of give the details to the Supreme Court. This act gave the Supreme Court 6 members, and it set up a system of less powerful federal courts. Washington selects this guy named John Jay as the first Chief Justice, who is like the head person of the Supreme Court. So John Jay is the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Another thing that Washington sets up, and is something that we still do today, is the idea of the President's Cabinet. The Constitution gives the Congress the power to set up departments to help the president lead the nation. So just like a business owner would hire people to run certain aspects of the business, like payroll or transportation or food or buildings or whatever, the president chooses people to lead the departments of the nation that helps with like Treasury, like the money, or the State Department. And that those people that are the leaders of each of those departments become the cabinet, and George Washington is the first person to set this idea up. There was supposed to be these departments, but they didn't know that they were going to meet with these department heads and call them the cabinet or anything like that. And because George Washington sets that up, it's still something that we do today. Congress in the beginning set up 5 departments, really only 4. Postal wasn't added until a little bit later, but the first 5 were State, War, Treasury, Justice, and Postal. We have all of those today except for War is now called Defense. So the State Department dealt with relations with other nations, and Washington chooses Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State. So the first Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson. The War Department would deal with the nation's defense, and Washington chose Henry Knox to be the Secretary of War. Fort Knox is where we keep all the money that's named after him. The Treasury Department would deal with the nation's economy, and Washington chose Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of the Treasury. The Justice Department would guide the nation through legal matters and would be led by Edmund Randolph. He would be known as Attorney General. These department heads would make up the cabinet. The Constitution says nothing about the cabinet, but Washington set up the tradition carried through on to future presidents. This is a picture of the current cabinet of the United States, so a few more than 5. We've added more as time goes on. The most important thing the new nation had to deal with was the war debt. And it was up to Alexander Hamilton to try to figure this out, and that's because he was Secretary of the Treasury. This is Alexander Hamilton. He's on the $10 bill. Might be where you recognize him from. Hamilton knew that if the United States wanted other countries to take them seriously and do business with them, they would have to pay off their war debt. So he comes up with a plan to do this. It has three things that he wants to do as a part of his plan. He wants to pay off all war debt. He wants to raise government revenue, which is the amount of money that the government takes in. And he also wants to create a national bank. Hamilton wants the national government to pay off state debt. So he wants all of the debt to be kind of grouped into one, because right now, like Maine has a certain amount of debt that they're paying off. New York has a certain amount of debt that they're paying off. All this different type of stuff. And what he wants to do is the national government to collect all these taxes and pay off all this debt all at once. Southern states did not want this because they had already paid off a lot of their own debt. And to get the southern states to agree with Hamilton's plan, the northern states agreed that the nation's capital would be moved to the south. And that's how you get the capital in Washington, D.C. To pay off the war debt, Hamilton wanted to raise the nation's revenue, money we make. To do this, he favored tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. Tariffs serve two purposes. One is that the government makes more money off of the imports, so the things that are coming in, you have to pay a tax on, so the government gets that money. And the second thing is, it makes those imported goods more expensive. So that means that people are going to buy less of the imported good and more of the American-made good, which in turn makes the American business bigger, which means that they make more money, and then they also have to pay more taxes. So either way, the government is going to be able to collect more taxes. Hamilton also wanted to create a national bank in order to stabilize and safely keep all the government's money. Some people did not want this because the Constitution made no mention of a national bank. This is where two arguments come into play. You have the strict interpretation or you have the loose interpretation. So people like Thomas Jefferson had a strict view of the Constitution. Like, it doesn't have anything in there about national bank. Nothing in there says national bank, so you can't do it. Word for word, it isn't in there, so you can't do it. Alexander Hamilton says, well, the Constitution says that we can do anything necessary and proper for the country, and I feel like this is necessary and proper, so we should be able to do it. These two sides will set up the political differences that follow in the future, not only immediately, but they carry on into today's world. Washington knew that the country would need peace in order to succeed. To keep peace, Washington had to guide the country through a few challenges. Dealing with these challenges revealed the strength of the new government under the Constitution, because we're going to run in right now to a situation that is very similar to what happened in Shays' Rebellion. And when Shays' Rebellion happened, the national government couldn't do anything, and it almost failed miserably. And it really leads to the reason why we have to set up a whole new government. We're going to see a very similar situation here with the Whiskey Rebellion, and the government is able to step up and handle its business. In another attempt to raise money and pay off the war debt, Alexander Hamilton pushed for a tax on whiskey. This made farmers in the backcountry very unhappy because whiskey was their main source of income. In the summer of 1794, farmers started the Whiskey Rebellion. They burned homes and threatened to attack Pittsburgh. Washington had to keep the order, so he used this as a chance to prove that the national government could enforce its laws even on the frontier. See, back with the Articles of Confederation, it was like those curfews the parents give you, but you have to enforce them. Those are like the laws. But now it's like, this is your curfew. You have to be back or we're going to ground you for 6 months. So George Washington is using this chance to prove that the laws mean something. He sent 20,000 troops to confront the farmers. The farmers fled, and 20 of the leaders are captured. Washington now proved that the government of the United States could, and in fact would, enforce the laws that it makes. It's no more empty laws, if you will. All right, so that is Chapter 9, Section 1.